So I keep seeing a lot of nonsense about effective aperture and calculators for what the aperture of your crop sensor lens is and all this stuff. And I'm here to tell you that the aperture of your lens is exactly what it says on the lens. No, you dim-witted poser, that is not how aperture works. There is so much gatekeeping nonsense around sensor size. And so today we're gonna do some real world tests. I get a little tired of this whole YouTuber, influencer, expert. I started photography 5 years ago, guys, getting on here and telling new photographers how things work and being like, oh no, this is the sensor you need. Oh no, this is the lens you need. I've been doing this for over 25 years now. And man, back in my day, and I know I'm old maybe, and I started on film, but for like the first 5 years of studying photography, I didn't even attempt to charge for a single thing. It was just studying. It was just learning. And now we've got all these photography influencers who frankly a lot of times are better at making videos than they are at taking photos because they're not really studying photos. They're just looking for sensational clickbait headlines. Okay, not here to be a whiner, just here to talk about real technique like we always do on this channel. And today I want to talk about focal lengths and their apertures and their bokeh. There's this really common thing, and I see the question asked on my channel. And it is a good question because there's a ton of misinformation. Let's say you have a full frame sensor, right? This is a 35mm equivalent sensor. Okay, fine. Then you have a crop sensor. So you have a smaller sensor like a Micro Four Thirds or a Fuji or 1.6 crop, something like that. Let's use this Micro Four Thirds as an example because it is a 2x crop of the full frame sensor from a full frame. Full frame 50mm 1.4 is what I have on this. Then let's grab this little Olympus, great camera, small. I use it honestly more than the full frame. A 50mm equivalent on this is a 25, right? 2x crop. So both of these are a 50mm field of view. We're good. Now here's where YouTuber experts confusing people come in so that they can get videos. They're like, oh, well, the 1.4 25mm, 50mm equivalent, and the 50mm 1.4, aperture-wise, this lens on the crop sensor is actually like a 2.8 or an f4 lens. No, it's not. An f1.4 lens is an f1.4 lens on this camera, and it's an f1.4 lens on this camera. Because the aperture rating is how much light is being allowed to enter the lens. And then I said, well, yeah, but the bokeh, don't tell me that. A 1.4 lens is not a 2.8, it's not an f4, it's not a 2.0. An f1.4 lens at 1.4 is 1.4. That's how much light can come through. So is there more bokeh on the full frame? Yes. Let's look. Now in a minute I'll get Sandra in here to help me with a portrait. But to start with, let's just stand right here, 50mm equivalent, and I'm gonna focus right here on my tripod head on the Micro Four Thirds. Okay? All right, here we go. Same focal length on the Nikon ZF. This is an adapted Minolta Rocker 1.4, 50 mils. Okay, I'm gonna take the same photo. So yes, if you look at these in this technical comparison, we have a difference. Now you can see on the left here, we have the 50mm 1.4. Now it says F1G because it's adapted, so I had to note these manually. But this is the Minolta here on the Nikon, and on the right we have the 25mm Leica on the Micro Four Thirds. Now you can see a distinct difference in the bokeh, and if we zoom in, you can see it as well. Now there's also a difference in contrast here, and depending on the lens you're using, when you shoot it wide open at 1.4, it might not be as contrasty. This is especially true of vintage lenses, but that's not the point of this comparison. What we really want to look at is not sharpness and contrast, but how it's affecting the bokeh. Okay, here we are at 2.8 on the 50mm 1.4 on the Nikon on the left, and still on that 25mm on the Micro Four Thirds, okay? So you can see, in this case, yes, the Leica on the Micro Four Thirds has quite a bit more contrast than the old vintage lens, but again, look at that bokeh. There's still more bokeh on the 50mm. In fact, one final test here, we actually have to stop down the 50mm to about f4 on the left here, f4, to get the same bokeh more or less as the 25mm. So yeah, we're talking about like a 3-stop difference, which sounds like a lot when people are doing these comparisons. The problem is it's a bad comparison. Aperture is about light transmission. So you know you're gonna have 3 stops of difference in bokeh in your portrait sounds like a lot, But in the real world, it's nothing like 3 stops of light transmission. And we'll see that in a second here. But the aperture's still the same. The f1.4 on micro four thirds is an f1.4 lens. It has less bokeh because it's a 25 millimeter lens, not because there's some inherent difference in how aperture works on this different sensor. So do you get more blur on this? Yes, but that's both good and bad. In fact, I will oftentimes pick up the crop sensor micro four thirds intentionally if I'm doing street or if I'm doing a scene where I actually want more depth of field. I don't want to be hunting focus. I want to maybe put it at f8 and just go and not have to refocus. A smaller sensor is great because now you're getting that wider depth of field of a 25. I would take either of these out and do portraits without even a question. If I really need creamy bokeh on the micro four thirds, I'll put like the 56 millimeter Sigma, or I'll mount a vintage lens, like a vintage 55 or something like that has tons of bokeh, and go that route. The YouTubers whose sole focus is not actually teaching you to take photos and are just showing you and selling you gear with their affiliate links and sponsorships are not actually teaching you how to take photos, because the bokeh doesn't matter that much. Do I like a fast lens? Yes, but normally I choose a fast lens and run it wide open because I want a lot of light. I like to shoot in low light. I like to shoot without a flash, etc. Do I like bokeh as much as the next portrait photographer? Sure, I could throw all kinds of photos up here showing off bokeh. But I can get perfectly great bokeh on either one of these. I would go out anytime with these influencer YouTubers that almost only talk about new gear and barely spend any time out taking photos, and that have been 5 years in the industry, with my 25 years experience, and give me the old dated micro four thirds with a 25 mil, 1.8 even, and them with their big fancy 85, 1.4 on some $4,000 body. I'll happily take them on. And this isn't a gatekeeper thing, hating on newer photographers who haven't been in the industry as long. I'm actually doing the opposite. The gatekeeping is this idea that we always need these huge, ridiculous lenses. People invest so much money in this, and I like getting new gear as much as the next guy. But this 85 mil Sony 1.8, which isn't that expensive of a lens compared to these big 1.4s and 1.2s that people have orgasms over, I could take portraits all day long on this, on the full frame, and it's just fine. It just doesn't matter that. Before we close out this short video, let's do a real example. Let's put a model right here in my cluttered office and see, even though it's cluttered and crap in here, can we make a good portrait on both of these? In my messy office, you can see it's a disaster, and normally I would not shoot a portrait in this, but it will be a good representation for just how that bokeh is actually working. Because remember, your aperture is simply a size in relation to your focal length. And so that concept doesn't change depending on your sensor size. So here we are on the Olympus at 25 mil. It's a 50 mil equivalent. I'm at 1.4 on this one. Put your eyes right toward the window there, right there. Good, hold it. So we're just taking the natural window light, and you can see all my clutter kind of fading off into the background here on this one. Same aperture on a 50 mil on full frame. But this is the key thing that people are always getting confused. The difference here is that it's a 50, not that it's full frame. I could adapt this same vintage 50 to the crop sensor, and yes, I would have a 100 mil equivalent, but that would work just fine for portraits. I'd just have to get back a little further. Put your head a little more that way. There you go. Drop your chin a little. And let me just do one for funsies at f2.8, because at f2.8, we're probably going to get a very similar depth of field as we did on the 25, maybe still a little bit more bokeh on this one. Now, with a real model, this is better than just using a tripod head as an example. So here we go. Just gonna take a couple more, a little bit back, a little bit tilted the other way, this way, there you go. Drop the chin a little, eyes this way. Okay, right there, again, 1.4, a little bit of smile, relax your face a little. 1.4 at 50, stay, keep it right there. And 1.4 at 25, like you're tugging at it. There you go, right there, right there, right there, just like that. So another thing is that you can just use your feet. All right, 1.4 at 50. Thank you, lovely, that's good. If you really insist on having more bokeh on the micro four thirds, we'll put a longer lens. I love like the 56 mil Sigma f1.4 on micro four thirds. It's a phenomenal portrait lens, and it has a field of view of about 100. And truth told, you could take a vintage 50 mil on micro four thirds and also get that same thing with about the same bokeh. The key thing here is that any one of these cameras or lens combinations work fine. The truth is we way overhype bokeh. Yeah, we all love a lens that can give this nice creamy bokeh, but in the real world, my best portraits usually don't have a bokeh that's like completely blurred out. They usually have a little bit of texture, or trees or roads or buildings in the background, because that completely blurred out bokeh just doesn't really add that much to most images. I mean, at the end of the day, what most of these influencers are missing is that taking great photos is about creating emotion. It's about taking the three-dimensional world and bringing it into the two-dimensional world, like I'm talking about on Shadow Hackers all the time. It's about creating feeling and drama. And the amount of blur in your background is not what defines that. Sure, you can have a favorite lens. You might like this blur over that blur. You might like how one lens makes a bokeh over another. And it's fun looking at all these videos. But at the end of the day, I don't pick up a camera because of what bokeh I'm going to get. If I go out shooting and I want to be on the go, I'll grab the Micro Four Thirds. If I'm doing a session where I know I'm doing a session and I want to put on all those classic vintage lenses like my Nikkor 105-25, I'll take the full frame because it adapts those vintage lenses at their native intended focal range. But I'll also take those vintage lenses sometimes and put them on a little Micro Four Thirds. The camera you have doesn't matter that much. We all love getting new lenses and gear, but the main thing is creating feeling. And the portraits I've made that had the most feeling, I was never stressing over, is the background blurry enough? And at the end of the day, this idea that if you have a 1.4 lens on a Micro Four Thirds or on another crop sensor, that it's actually a 2.8 or an f4, that's BS. A 1.4 25 is 1.4. An f2 Fuji 35 is f2. A 50 millimeter 1.4 on full frame is 1.4. The only thing that's changing, and that, yes, is giving you different amounts of depth of field, and bokeh is the focal length. But that doesn't mean that lens doesn't function as a 1.4, as a 1.8, as an f2. Stop thinking of your 1.4 as some lesser 2.8 because some full frame nerd told you it's not the same. Most of the people that are obsessed with this and making videos about it and acting like they're experts, they're not actually experts at all. And if they are, maybe they need to obsess a little bit less with sounding like experts to new photographers and focus on what it takes as photographers to make great images with feeling in this faked AI world. And what does that take? It takes practice and practice and practice. A photographer that knows how to use their gear doesn't worry about this stuff. And if you look at these, and I've put just a simple preset like Portra 160, Portra 400, or Kodachrome on these, we just have a simple window light. We have two completely different focal lengths that are 2x apart. They both work just fine. By the way, I'll put a link to my free film preset pack in the comments as well if you want to download those and play with them. And of course, if you like them and want the full pack, well, hey, I appreciate your support. That's the extent of the sponsorship of this video. Having a wider Micro Four Thirds or crop sensor lens is actually a good asset because it means I get more depth of field with a more open aperture. Why? Not because the lens is inherently different, but because the focal length is wider. Most of us, including myself, suffer from gear acquisition syndrome at some point. But understanding that new gear doesn't have to be the newest gear, that a great lens doesn't have to be the biggest and the most expensive. Aperture is a measure of light transmission, not of bokeh, even though aperture along with focal length affects your bokeh. The bottom line is you can stop worrying about this. The aperture of your lens, regardless of its crop factor, is exactly what it says on the lens, but bokeh and the quality thereof is not measured in an F number. So you decide the look you like, learn to be great with it, and run with it. If you guys found this useful, if you want to see more, hit that like and subscribe button. Let me know what you think in the comments, and we will see you next time. Peace.